Hi, it's Arjun with our first video podcast of 2025. It's been a great start to the year for both traditional energy and the power sectors, broadly speaking. And this video is being published just 2 days before, here in the United States, a new administration takes the helm. As we highlighted in our Super Spike post from kind of the end of December, as well as our introductory post for 2025 last week, we do feel kind of a great sense of optimism that the narratives and perspectives in and around the energy sector are starting to become more pragmatic and sensible after an especially rough stretch over the 2021 to 2024 period, though some of that extends back to 2018 and 2019 as well. We had a very narrow definition of the energy transition, which I think to most people meant a very quick movement out of fossil fuels only into renewables over some absurdly short time frame. There's no part of that definition that ever made sense. And that era has gone by the wayside. It ended, we're going to say, decisively in 2024. And I thought this is being recorded the day after Chris Wright's nomination hearing to be Secretary of Energy, which I found to be a remarkably civil and frankly pragmatic and reasonable debate about his views on energy and the environment and all sorts of topics going forward. He's, of course, President Trump's nominee for Secretary of Energy. Now, in this video, we hope to further expand on some of the key themes we illustrated in last week's post, but perhaps through the lens of what are some of the key pushbacks or questions that have been raised. And as a reminder, if you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify podcasts, there's a video that you can find on YouTube or on the Super Spike or Veriton websites. And if you only listen to the podcast on the weeks we don't publish one, on most weeks, I should say, there is usually a written post that you can find again on Substack or the Veriton website. So let me start with recapping what the big themes we highlighted for 2025 were. The first is energy scenario normalization and a return to energy being thought of in its traditional hierarchy of needs, that what we're solving for is abundance and reliability first and foremost, followed by affordability and geopolitical security. That does not mean we don't care about environmental or climate considerations, but the idea that the pyramid should be inverted and that somehow the narrative should be around how we solve for climate first and foremost, it never made sense. It was ridiculous, it was misguided, and frankly, it led to what we called a worst of all worlds, where you weren't solving any of your environmental or climate concerns, and you were running the risk of simply high and volatile commodity prices and the world not meeting its unquestioned economic objectives. That era decisively has ended, and it matters for both policymakers and companies, as we'll get into in this video. We also talked about power being this generation's super cycle within energy. 20 years ago, at the start and then heart of my career at Goldman Sachs, it was all about China and BRICS and what that was going to mean for energy, broadly speaking. This time around, it is all about power, which, and we'll get into it, does not mean every oil and gas company has to suddenly be a power company. We're not saying that. What we're saying is understand what the implications of this dominant macro trend is going to be and figure out if there are ways for you to participate in it. And if not, what are the counter trend opportunities you should be considering? And within that, we will talk about some of our favorite energy sources and technologies. We may not believe in the energy transition, but that doesn't mean nothing's changing. Our preferred phrasing is perpetual transition. And there's a host of both traditional and newer technologies that, frankly, we're quite excited about. And there's some that we're unexcited about, and we'll get into all of that. We're not going to do it this week, but we do want to circle back to other topics like the outlook for crude oil, China, M&A, and maybe US and Canadian energy policy, especially under new administrations that are going to happen here in the US and also in Canada in 2025, most likely, but we'll save that for future videos. So let me start with this topic of energy scenario normalization. This could sound like a pretty nerdy in the weeds type of idea to call a big theme, but these outlooks that you get from prominent producers like the IEA, from some of the larger oil companies, from a whole range of folks, Wall Street and academia, they have a very big influence on how policymakers and companies think about the outlook. I think they do matter. And we've been in a world where the preponderance of especially the high profile forecasts, especially from 2021 to 2024, only toggled between various net zero alternatives. We have no problem if someone wants to show what a net zero scenario might look like, you can debate timeframes, you can debate how likely it is, but sort of a scenario might make sense. The fact that the world acted as if every country and company was going to somehow follow this path as their primary goal, it never made sense. We pushed back on it from the get-go. It is a motivation to having created Super Spiked. It was a motivation to unretire at Verdun. And I can say with some relief here that the world is going to back off from net zero as its defining objective. That's not to say we shouldn't and won't care about meeting environmental and climate considerations, including reducing emissions. The question is how you get there. And until you solve for how everyone on Earth will someday be energy rich, I don't think you're solving for anything. And I will actually argue, and we'll get into it, that when you solve for billion-person scale economies ramping up the well-being of their citizens, they're going to be highly, highly motivated to figure out other stuff to do, a lot of the new technologies. And it is why we are excited about a whole range of opportunities in the energy sector. So one of the core pushbacks we get is, Arjun, you're just a believer in the status quo. And I'm going to say, absolutely not. Our framing or preferred language would be, we believe in perpetual transition, not the energy transition and a net zero is all that matters type of worldview. Things are always changing. The key to us, whether you're a policymaker or a company, is to understand those drivers and what causes those changes. And I will just say, there's no evidence anyone is actually solving for net zero. That is not the real preference of any person or country on Earth. You just have to look everywhere, whether it's Germany using coal when their gas was cut off, or whether it's the ramp ups in China and India and other developing world countries. What everyone cares about at all times, not some of the time, at all times, is abundance and reliability first and foremost. You'd prefer it be affordable, you'd prefer it be geopolitically secure, but you'll care most that it's there when you want it. Over long periods of time, it is going to have to be affordable, and ideally, it's going to be geopolitically secure. And it's that last point, geopolitical security, that I think China is a great example of why the world will change. This is not about status quo. This is about understanding the drivers and responding accordingly. So you've heard me say this before, so I'll say it more quickly this time. China's gone from 0 to 11 to 12 million barrels a day of oil imports. They've barely gone from poor to middle income as a nation. If they were to get to rich country levels, you're talking about a further doubling or tripling of their crude oil imports. And there's no chance China's going to want to do that. And so you see the sort of forced push for EVs, which has had quite a bit of success in that country. You've seen LNG trucks. You're seeing them do everything in their power to figure out how can we not further ramp up our oil imports. And so this notion of geopolitical security and affordability for the perspective of Chinese consumers and the government, that to me is going to be the motivation to thinking about a range of technologies. And we do have to ask, what is this going to mean for India and the rest of Southeast Asia? So when people see me push back on the energy transition, it's too simplistic to say, oh, you don't care about climate enough, or you're not taking the risks seriously. That's not accurate. That's not the point. Point for me is, if you're a policymaker, if you're a company, is to really understand what is that outlook for energy and not fall into what I think have been a lot of false narratives about what people are saying the world wanted. So I want to give an example of how energy transition narratives and the different outlooks that companies have had can impact the actual performance. And I'm looking here at ExxonMobil versus BP, the market capitalizations, it's billions of dollars, US dollars, from 2019 to present. And you can see a dramatic divergence where ExxonMobil has meaningfully outperformed BP. And let me, before I go any further, caveat all this by saying, at Veriton, at Super Spiked, we prefer to not talk about individual names, especially in a contemporary situation. What happened 25 years ago, early in my career, can be fun to talk about, but we try and avoid discussing contemporary situations. I think in this one specifically, there was an article in the Financial Times earlier this week that basically had a very similar version of this graph. I think they used market caps as well. It might have gone back further. But I think this notion of some of the challenges BP's facing at the present versus ExxonMobil are pretty well out there, that I think it's going to be okay to talk about this, even though I'm now talking about specific companies. I also want to say that throughout my career, I've come across people from both of these companies, and there are a lot of great people at ExxonMobil. There are a lot of great people at BP. Our point in discussing this is to try and illustrate how outlooks, whether the degree to which one sort of bought into energy transition narratives, I think impacted why you had such a divergence in performance. So hopefully I've caveated all this okay. I'll make just a few points on this graph. If you're starting at 2019, both ExxonMobil and BP, both of their market caps and stock prices got hit going into that COVID period, and especially the October 2020 trough. I think they both troughed, I believe, on actually the exact same day. Since that trough, ExxonMobil is up 266%. BP is only up 66%. And over this entire period, BP is down by a third over 5+ years in market cap, whereas Exxon's up by 2/3. It is really very dramatic divergence in performance that I think bears some explanation. And it really was in that sort of COVID trough and maybe just after period that we first saw the IEA come out with their infamous net zero by 2050 report. It's a report that we pushed back hard on. It motivated us to start super spiked. It motivated us to unretire. You also saw the European super majors collectively, not just BP, come out with similar versions of these kind of outlooks. I will give BP and the Europeans credit that I think they actually better caveated their outlooks by being very clear that these are not forecasts and that there are a range of possibilities that could occur. And any one scenario by default is going to be wrong. But to me, it had a very big impact on how they thought about their businesses. All of them changed to, we are integrated energy companies, no longer integrated oils. And from my perspective, the approach to energy transition was one of, we need to address our scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, and therefore we're going to look at a whole range of different businesses. But it came from that net zero is what we're solving for kind of world. And that is what I'm pushing back on. And I would contrast that with the US energy sector in general. We're going to highlight ExxonMobil here specifically. It's not just ExxonMobil, it's their fellow large companies, as well as a whole host of smaller companies that stuck with energy is always about trying to meet the world's energy needs. A very different perspective on it's what we're all going back to. You have to meet reliability and abundance with then affordability and geopolitical security. And I will say that the US sector collectively didn't veer from that anywhere near as much as the Europeans did. And in just this short 5-year period, you can see the dramatic implications of how one translated a worldview and an outlook into market capitalizations. And that is the essence of the point we're trying to make. In the case of ExxonMobil, and this is true of other US oil and gas companies as well, especially the larger ones, it was not about sticking your head in the sand and saying, quote, business as usual, nothing's changed. None of them said that. They've all got low carbon businesses and various technologies they're pursuing. The question was, were you pursuing new technologies because you saw an opportunity to generate competitively advantaged returns where it fit with your core skill set? Or were you trying to, quote, help the world solve net zero challenges? And I can get critique that I'm overstating those differences. It's hard to otherwise explain such a large divergence in performance here. Now, I will say this, to again, caveat some of what I've said. Throughout my career, there's been US versus Europe's come in and out of favor. When you're a large company like ExxonMobil or Chevron or any other companies, or BP, Shell, Total, you tend to be a large portion of your local index, and the S&P 500 has significantly outperformed European benchmark indices. So any company in that index is going to get a little bit of a tailwind or headwind accordingly. Oil and gas companies especially can always be at different points in their capital spending cycles for projects. So in the case of ExxonMobil, as an example, Guyana has been ramping up. That's a very profitable project. The exact timing of some of BP's projects might have been a little bit different. So this is not purely explained by one having sort of an outlook that I agreed with one that I would push back on more. But this is a pretty big difference in performance. And that net zero mindset, I'm just going to say, has not worked out for any country that I can see. And I don't think it's worked out for very many companies. So let me turn to this idea that we are in a power supercycle, and that it is this generation's version of sort of China or BRICS expansion. And I think the question really that we want to address today is, if you are a molecule company, i.e. you're a traditional oil and gas company anywhere in the value chain, should you be going into electrons? Historically, these are two very different businesses. Whenever people talk about energy, there's a version that's oil and gas that kind of relates to crude oil and transportation fuels. And even natural gas, while it's always been used in power, is always the upstream production, maybe the midstream processing of it. And that's been very different from utilities or merchant powers and that side. They're really two very separate industries, and they're converging. We now have, thanks to a whole host of reasons that I think people know, we've got an aging grid and infrastructure in the developed world. We've got more intermittent resources. At the same time, we've been retiring baseload and dispatchable resources. We've got growing economic and therefore power demand in the developing world. And all of this is being turbocharged by digital revolution, artificial intelligence, data centers, et cetera. And so collectively, there's an understandable focus on the power sector. If you are in oil and gas, if you're in molecules, should you be thinking about this business? And I would say, let me start with the larger companies. One of the silver linings of all the pressure over the last 3 or 4 years to, quote, get on board with energy transition is it did force them to look at a host of different technologies and businesses. So while we push back on the idea that you have to do low carbon and that you have to transition, we never thought you should have to do it. The world's going to need a lot of oil and gas, and we should absolutely want US, Canadian, European companies doing as much as they can. Otherwise, you're going to be dependent on foreign companies that may or may not be your friend. But that aside, I think the idea of studying new technologies has been important. And we've generally been in favor of companies having some of these low carbon or new technology, whether it's business units or portfolio investments, whatever the case may be, and studying it. And I think it sets them up well to at least evaluate what are the range of things we can be doing, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what fits our core skill set, what doesn't. And relative to, say, 10 or 20 years ago, where I don't think, especially the larger super major or very large independents would have been in a position to think about different business models, it is one of the silver linings of the last 3 or 4 years. I think for smaller companies, the competitive advantage is you can be more nimble, potentially. That doesn't mean it's going to work out, but you can at least try. And we've seen a trio of oil service companies announce various distributed power generation type alternatives, and you can look up for yourselves how they've done. We'll see if those work out or not. Our point would be you've seen some nimbleness in these smaller companies. And again, there's no one size fits all business model. I think one of the questions is, what's the best way to optimize and monetize your molecules? If you're selling gas in the Permian Basin and you in recent periods have gotten a zero or negative gas price, and we know it's tough to build new transmission lines, and we know it's tough to even build any type of infrastructure in this country, is there an opportunity, and I don't know how it is, but to help monetize those with some sort of power agreement and whatever contracts or structure or venture that might take. But it's worth thinking about, it's worth evaluating as just one example. Do you need new skill sets? Do you need new people? These are all questions basically large and small companies should be asking. Do you have the expertise in-house? Do you want to get outside expertise? And then are there integration opportunities? Anytime you have a newer area, it can often be where an integrated model can make more sense. I actually think of Tesla as an example of this, where their ability to sort of be integrated back to the batteries, to the cars, I think has been a competitive. Apple's another example of a company that has been integrated between hardware and software. The equivalent things within energy might make some sense. And that can be true for smaller companies. I'm not talking about integrated oils per se here. The real question is, can you generate good returns in the power business? And do they compete with what you get in traditional oil and gas? So here we're looking at the sector's returns on capital going back to 1990. And I'm going to emphasize the green line, which is your best in class line. That's always the objective. That's the median point between the first and second quartile return on capital company. It's actually averaged 14%. And I think that opportunity to generate 15, let's just call it mid-teens returns, it absolutely is the objective for any traditional oil and gas company. Now, we know they don't all achieve it. You can see the median line is lower, and sadly, the third and fourth quartile line is pretty unattractive. But the objective is actually to be best in class. And it's really those companies that you say, how would a power market opportunity, does it meet this kind of hurdle? Now, these are unlevered returns. Why do we look at unlevered returns in oil and gas? It's because it's a volatile business. And so there's a notion of needing to have a, quote, fortress balance sheet with minimal debt. And to be able to absorb the inherent volatility of the business, you've generally wanted to have a lower amount of leverage and therefore also generate a higher return. In power markets, depending on the opportunity, you often do not have anywhere near that same degree of volatility in your power price as you would, say, oil or natural gas prices. So is it possible, is it acceptable to perhaps have a lower return but have it be more stable? If it's more stable, can you take on more leverage? If you take on more leverage, how do you think about your aggregate balance sheet? Do you do this in a joint venture or an equity affiliate? How do you capitalize these things? And if you look at risk-adjusted returns in a power sector, do you have competitive advantage to generate those returns? Are you going to actually achieve them? And how is that going to match up with what, so like there's lots of structural questions to be asked, and we'll see if we can answer them. This to me, though, is the hurdle. Is it going to be a good business? It's definitely hot right now. Stocks exposed to those sectors have generally gone up, but we know those things can be temporary. Over the long run, is there attractive risk-adjusted return, and what is the right business model to match that? These are the questions we're going to try and answer, and I think boards and managements, especially in the quote molecule space, are going to have to wrestle with. So in this last little bit here, I want to talk about how we've thought about our favorite and least favorite energy sources and technologies. And I started with the idea that I don't think the energy transition was ever a logical kind of thing, but we are believers in perpetual transition. And really, unlike earlier parts of my career, there's a much broader range of energy sources, technologies, how countries are going to meet their demand, especially with the rise of billion-person scale economies. It's not just going to be about economic development the way it was always done, or at least it was done in the US and Europe and Japan and South Korea. It's going to be, in some ways, similar, but in some ways very different. So how can one think about attractive and unattractive energy growth opportunities? And I think where we feel, I guess, most bullish on in terms of volume of growth potential, it's going to be the natural gas space, and it's actually going to be in solar. And I think there's a lot of complementary nature of these two technologies. In the case of natural gas, it clearly can serve as both baseload and peaking power generation. And in a world with growing intermittent resources, which I think are going to continue to grow for geopolitical reasons, and I'll get to that, natural gas is a phenomenal complementary fuel. For those of you out there who say, well, what about the emissions? Methane is highly solvable for the most part, and I've long supported proactively dealing with methane. I don't think anything should change about that, new administrations or not. And I think on the carbon capture side, that is an area I admittedly need to do more work on. I've heard from proponents who are very bullish on carbon capture with natural gas. I do think that's an area worth studying. In the case of solar, I think it sometimes gets misbranded as you'd only do it for, quote, climate reasons. It is certainly generally low carbon in nature. Solar panels, I'm not sure, are totally renewable. It feels like you got to redo them every certain number of years. They don't last forever. But I think it is geopolitical security, especially for countries that get very good solar radiation. I'm thinking of places like India, thinking of other parts of Southeast Asia. I'm thinking the Middle East, where the sun shines strongly. It's going to make sense to do some decent portion of solar. Why? Because once that panel's up and running, you may not like where that panel came from, and I don't always like where it came from. But once it's up and running, it's a de facto domestic resource, and that is really attractive. And your variable cost is zero. That's really attractive. So we can critique how one is thinking about the upfront capex versus the intermittency going forward. A lot of things we can legitimately critique. But once it's up and running, it's zero variable cost while it's shining, while the sun is shining, and it's a de facto domestic resource. And I think these two products, technologies, natural gas and solar, actually can go very well together. And again, nothing I'm saying suggests that oil and gas companies should be doing solar. We're not arguing that. We're arguing that when you think about how countries are going to develop, when you think about how India is going to develop, what the Middle East is going to do, I actually think these two things have a real chance. And I think the debate, especially for India, is will they go down the same road that China did in using domestic coal to balance that with solar? And this is where LNG can be way more expensive than domestic coal. I don't think there's any question about that. But how do we think about the environmental attributes? I think that is going to play a role. And how does natural gas fit into being part of a diversified mix? And will there be pressure put on either cleaning up the coal for a country like India or figuring out some other environmental objective? Those objectives are still going to count. Less excited about big wind. I'm going to differentiate some smaller niche wind companies from big wind. But big wind does not enjoy the same modularity that solar does. The cool thing about solar is you can put the panels on your roof. You can match it with a battery pack and you can be less on the grid than you otherwise would be. Maybe that's more for affluent people, but it is possible. You can't have your own, for the most part, big wind turbine or natural gas plant or nuclear plant for that matter. I think big wind has some challenging economics and does not enjoy some of the same benefits that solar does. And I've generally been especially a green hydrogen skeptic. It's not that there's no uses of hydrogen, there clearly are, but the idea that this is going to be a major replacement fuel for fossil fuels, I'm going to continue to push back hard on that. Certainly if we're talking about the green variety of hydrogen, most notably. Nuclear, clearly gaining momentum. It is a long-term technology. I think one of the other advantages of solar is you can construct it and get it online more quickly. Natural gas, there's some delays in the turbines right now, but that's next in line. Nuclear for sure is a long-term thing, but gaining momentum. And I think worth studying, and it's in the study category, is geothermal and long-duration storage. We remain open-minded to both. But when we look at all these technologies, and I already mentioned in the previous discussion that where are there integration opportunities, is when you think about energy, I don't think anyone can know when oil demand is going to peak. I don't understand how I certainly don't think we know when natural gas demand is going to peak. But the nature of how billion-person scale economies, the nature of how they're going to use energy is certainly going to be different than how the US ramped up, or even Japan or South Korea. And they're going to want some portion of the new stuff for geopolitical reasons, and potentially even capital flow and therefore affordability reasons, even if notionally your incremental oil field or gas field is lower cost than some of the newer technologies. You're going to have to look at this on an all-in basis, not just the cost of supply, but what it means for capital flows. And again, once you've paid for your solar panels, it's a domestic resource, and you don't have to keep paying for them and having foreign currency outflow as you sometimes have to do with traditional oil and gas. Again, I think all these things are going to grow a lot, but we find it really interesting to think about as these different nations develop, how is their mix, what is their mix going to be? And what is the timing and likelihood of this other stuff ramping up? So I'd like to end this video on a personal note. I'm recording this video the day after the Senate Energy Committee's hearing for the nomination of Chris Wright to be President-elect Trump's Secretary of Energy. And a few takeaways. First of all, I thought it was an outstanding hearing. From a big picture standpoint, a lot of the sort of progress we are hoping for and talking about and why we write Super Spike, I thought came through in that hearing, where the questions were reasonable. There were 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans asking questions. There might have been a singular Democratic senator who might have been grandstanding a little bit. His community is going through a trying time, so I think we'll forgive it. But I think from the other 9 senators on both sides of the aisle, these were reasonable questions. It's the kind of discussion and debate we should be having. And of course, for those of you in the investment community or in the oil and gas world who know Chris, it was awesome to hear Chris sound like Chris. That's the Chris Wright we know. He was no different at that hearing in terms of delivering straightforward, no-nonsense answers that were steeped in data and analysis. And while it reflected his worldview for sure, I would have expected no less. As he said, he is new to government and he's not a politician. And it is so refreshing to hear someone who actually knows a lot about energy and the environment and different technologies and climate sit there and answer questions like a normal human being. Awesome job by Chris Wright. I thought it was telling that both Republicans and Democrats both asked essentially all of the above type questions. That might have been a little bit of a surprise from the Republican side. It's unfortunate, I've said, that oftentimes these energy technologies get a partisan labeling. That's absolute nonsense. So it was nice to hear Republicans talk about the different technologies and how to think about them. And by the same token, I appreciated the Democrats, in my opinion, were asking reasonable questions about all of the above as well, but also for some of their environmental and climate questions. There wasn't that sort of urgent climate crisis type narrative that I think has been not helpful to having an intelligent and healthy debate about what kind of energy and environmental policies we should have. So kudos to both sides, to the hearing, to Chris Wright. Again, it is only a short period of time till he's going to be our Secretary of Energy. And there's no one more excited than me about this. And again, great job, Chris, yesterday. Great job to the Senate Energy Committee. I hope that can be maintained going forward. And we'll see you next week. Thanks.